Welcome to the Veterinary Rehabilitation Podcast, where we aim to help fellow veterinary rehab therapists increase their knowledge and elevate their practice. I'm Megan Kelly.
And I'm Lloyd. Together, we bring you the latest insights, research, and information in the field of veterinary rehabilitation.
This podcast is brought to you by Onlinepethealth, a leading continuing education membership for veterinary rehabilitation therapists. With Onlinepethealth, you will have access to a wide range of online resources to help you stay up to date with the latest techniques, advances, and trends in the industry.
Our podcast features in-depth conversations with leading experts in veterinary rehabilitation. They share their own experiences and knowledge to help you improve your practice. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting out in the field, our goal is to provide you with the tools and the insights you need to succeed.
So join us as we explore the exciting world of veterinary rehabilitation and help you take your practice to the next level. Hey vet rehabbers, now today we're diving into one of those questions that every therapist who uses kinesiotape has probably wondered at some point. Does the direction of application really matter? So do we actually facilitate or inhibit a muscle's function depending on whether we apply the tape from origin to insertion or from insertion to origin? Now, in this episode, we're going to explore several human-based research studies because, unfortunately, there just aren't any animal studies that we can look directly at. We've all been taught that the direction matters, that to strengthen or facilitate a muscle, we need to apply the tape in a certain way with a certain amount of stretch, allowing it to recoil towards the anchor to create that facilitation effect. But is that really true? And is it true in people? And can we assume that the same principles apply to our canine and equine patients? So Anae unpacks all the research for us. If you're looking for some continuing education opportunity, we have 3 free webinars available for you. An evidence-based approach to cranial cruciate ligament rupture rehabilitation with Lonnie Alvarez, hydrotherapy for patellar luxations with Ansi van der Walt, and the horse hoof connection with Yogi Shop. You can head over to onlinepethealth.com/free to sign up for any of those webinars. A quick word from our sponsors before we dive into today's topic. At Paw Prosper, we believe true pet well-being demands a 3-pronged approach: prevention, support, and rehabilitation. Our brands are trusted by veterinarians, universities, and rehab facilities alike. So whether you're looking to train, rehabilitate, or help your patients age gracefully, our brands, Walking Pets, Help 'em Up, Respond Animal Therapeutics, Bit Paws, Muffins, Halos, Sleepy Pod, and Canine Carts offer effective, innovative, and proven solutions. You can sign up today to receive a one-time special gift for all our Online Pet Health listeners with your next order, and you can sign up going to pawprosper.com/OPH. All right, over to Anae.
Good morning and welcome to this month's Research Refresh. Today we're going to look at kinesiotape and specifically muscle applications that are meant to facilitate or inhibit the function of a specific muscle. So I was recently at a kinesiotaping certification course at Gilvari Equine Rehab and Spa, and we learned so many interesting applications. Honestly, I actually took a lot away from that. But one of the questions that wasn't fully answered for me was whether we as equine and small animal rehab practitioners should be using an origin to insertion or an insertion to an origin application specifically for the goal of inhibiting or facilitating a muscle's function. So I decided to look at the research and share that with you. That's what we do here. So let's go. All right, before we go into a bunch of research articles, so this is a review of a few articles. Let's just start with the basic preconceived idea. This was developed by Kenzo Case and has been taught ever since wherever you learn kinesiotape applications. All of the research that I'm going to look at today is human research because we just don't have the research in equines or small animals to be able to answer this question. But we start with the preconceived idea that a distal to proximal application in people will inhibit muscle function and a proximal to distal application will facilitate a muscle's function. And when we adapt that to dogs and horses, and some of the human research also use this terminology, insertion to origin will inhibit function and origin to insertion will facilitate function. All right, so our first paper is a 2014 paper with Gomez Soriano and a bunch of others, and it looks at the effects of kinesiotaping on muscle tone in healthy subjects. It is a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover trial. The main goal for them was to assess whether kinesiotape would modulate muscle tone or other associated measures such as extensibility, strength, and evoked EMG activity. So to achieve this goal, they did a double-blind crossover trial. They had a masking technique so that the subject and the evaluator were blinded to the application, and they had a sham and active kinesiotape applications. All right, so they looked at the gastrocnemius muscle function, and they had a few different measures. Okay, so this is how they applied their tape. This is the sham protocol. Both were covered with the sleeve so that you wouldn't be able to tell which application a subject had. They measured passive resistive torque at a slow and a fast speed, the passive range of motion, and maximum voluntary isometric force achieved. And then they also did muscle EMG activity for that gastrocnemius. The results, for passive resistive torque, there was no significant difference. Passive range of motion and MVIF, that maximum voluntary isometric force test, there was no significant differences between groups. Dorsiflexion peak force was lower following kinesiotape application when compared to sham in one condition, and EMG activity was 6% higher directly after application. Okay. In conclusion, their findings demonstrate that the application of kinesiotape on the gastrocnemius muscle has no effect on healthy muscle tone, extensibility, or strength. Our second paper is a 2022 paper, by Mario Lopez. Kinesiology tape increases muscle tone, stiffness, and elasticity, effects of the direction of tape application. The purpose of the study was to determine the immediate effects of two forearm applications, facilitatory or inhibitory, on muscle tone, stiffness, and elasticity, assessed with a non-invasive myometer in young adults. They hypothesized that there would be an improvement in muscle performance with facilitatory applications. This is essentially their methods, right? They started by assessing for eligibility. They excluded 6 people who did not meet the inclusion criteria. 39 participants remained, and they were randomized into one of 3 groups: a facilitatory group, where kinesiotape was applied from origin to insertion of the flexor muscles of the wrist and fingers; an inhibitory group, where kinesiotape was applied from insertion to origin of the flexor muscles of the wrist and fingers; and a control group who had no application. A handheld mechanical impulse-based myotometric device was used to measure their outcome measures. I don't know how this device works. I haven't been able to find a good answer, but I think that it applies mechanical taps and then it analyzes the muscle's response. So the machine applies a mechanical stimulus and then measures the response. To me, I question how this translates to an active muscle contraction, and therefore how it translates to function in a real-world scenario, right? So this is measuring, firstly, the muscle tone in a resting state, which is indicated by the oscillation frequency. Secondly, elasticity, which represents the capacity to recover the muscle shape after a contraction, indicated by the logarithmic decrement of a muscle's natural oscillation. And thirdly, the stiffness, or the muscle resistance to contraction. Okay, results. Overall, there were no significant differences among groups in the characteristics of the participants. So, yeah, there were no differences between groups at baseline in muscle tone, stiffness, and elasticity. The inhibitory kinesiotape application did not change the mechanical properties of the flexor muscles of the wrists and fingers, but The facilitatory application increased muscle tone, stiffness, and elasticity. Okay, so a nice green dot for this one. This paper shows that we are achieving our goal to facilitate muscle contraction or muscle function. Fantastic. I should at this point insert that I have a really strong bias that this doesn't work. So this paper says I'm wrong, and yeah, I want to question this paper's validity because I don't know how that little unit works that they use to measure it. But let's look at the rest of the papers as well. Okay, so our next one is a 2016 study with Elita Vered, and it looks at the influence of kinesiotape application direction on peak force of the biceps brachii muscle, and it's a repeated measures study. Right, so the aim was to evaluate the influence of kinesiotape application direction on peak force of biceps brachii in healthy subjects. They had a single group randomized order, repeated measures, convenience sample study. Subjects and investigators were both blinded. Peak force was measured with a handheld digital dynamometer, which is a clinical setting tool for measuring muscle strength. These are the three applications that they used. So this is their sham application, 2 horizontal stripes on that, or horizontal eye strips. Then they have a proximal to distal application and a distal to proximal application. Okay, the other way. Proximal to distal, distal to proximal. All right, this is how they perform that peak force evaluation test, right? So a subject sat on a stool with his or her back and arm leaning against a wall. The tested elbow is in 90 degrees of flexion. The tester stood on the tested limb side and stabilized the digital dynamometer against the distal part of the subject's arm. The subject then pressed up on the dynamometer, pushing on it as strongly as they could by flexing the elbow, and the tester then recorded the maximum peak force. At each evaluation, the tester was blinded to the previous evaluation outcomes, right? And so this is blinded because the subject is wearing a long sleeve shirt. Neither one of them knows which application the subject has on their biceps brachii. Results, there were 16 participants. There was no difference in the biceps peak force. So what I do want to mention here is that, right, this is clinically applicable. We can test this and replicate this in clinical practice. We can use a little tool that tells us how much newtons of force the person is pushing against us. That makes sense to me. Okay, so no difference in biceps peak force was found after evaluating no application, proximal to distal and distal to proximal. After a horizontal application, peak force was statistically significantly higher than in the other conditions. So what does that mean? 2 horizontal eye strips, which, if I'm not wrong, we are taught will inhibit a muscle's function. That is the only application that showed a significantly higher force production than either the proximal or the distal to proximal applications. Neither of those changed anything. So I think that's really something for us to think about, right? So their results essentially, kinesiotape application of 2 horizontal eye strips can immediately significantly increase peak force of the muscle of the biceps brachii, and 2, the kinesiotape application proximal to distal and distal to proximal have no immediate change in biceps brachii peak force. So what do we do with that information, right? I've added a green dot and a red dot here to separate those things for us because we are getting an increase in peak force of the muscle, and that's what we're looking for, is can we facilitate that muscle's function, but we are not facilitating it with the applications that we are taught will facilitate muscle function. We are doing it with an application that actually is supposed to stop, inhibit, or not influence the muscle's function at all, right? Something that we might use for a pain application potentially. So, okay, that's interesting. And then I red dot because essentially this is showing us that no, you cannot increase the muscle's activation or facilitate or inhibit it by proximal or distal to proximal applications. So, Okay. Our next study is a 2018 study, kinesiotaping effects with different directions and tensions on strength and range of movement of the knee, a randomized controlled trial with Lemos et al., a whole group of people. Let's jump into it. Taping effects with different directions and tensions on the strength of the rectus femoris and the range of motion of the knee on healthy individuals, but with a muscle imbalance caused by exposure to a continuous vibration before the tape. Okay, so they've introduced something else here. They performed a randomized controlled trial, which was double-blinded. The primary outcomes that they looked at were muscle strength and range of motion, and they measured that muscle strength with a handheld dynamometer and range of motion with a goniometer. This is how they divided things up. Okay, so subjects were assessed for eligibility. After exclusion, they had 32 subjects. They were divided into two groups, an origin to insertion and an insertion to origin group. So they received that application on the what was this one? Biceps rectus femoris. Okay. Then they had a tendon vibration applied to the patellar tendon for 20 minutes. A baseline measurement of muscle strength and knee range of motion was taken. Then kinesiotape was applied with 0% tension. After the application, they remeasured muscle strength and knee range of motion, and then they remeasured at 24 hours. Okay, so this vibration gives us a baseline that can be repeated, right? So I think that's a really interesting inclusion here that does make sense. So after 24 hours, they repeat, they remeasure, right, the day before's application. Then they remove it. They vibrate for 20 minutes. They take a new baseline measurement of muscle strength. Then they reapply the kinesiotape but with 10% tension. They remeasure strength and range of motion. And then 24 hours, they remeasure strength. Then they remove the tape. They vibrate for 20 minutes. They repeat with 75% tension. Repeat the measurements. All right. And they do that the same on the other side for insertion to origin application. They start with 0%, then 10%, then 75%. Before each measurement, before each application, they have that vibration. Then they measure a baseline. Then they apply, and then they remeasure, and then 24 hours later, they remeasure. So all in all, to me, this is a really well set out study. I like the inclusion of the vibration because it creates a repeatable baseline for the muscle. Like, this is what the muscle is and does and feels like, right? It's warmed up the same, it's prepared the same. The cross links between the myosin and actin, they are at one level before each of these tests are applied. So I like that. That makes sense. 32 subjects, no significant differences between groups, between tensions, or between times. Okay. In the study, kinesiotaping applied with different directions, facilitation or inhibition, and with different amounts of tension, 0, 10, 75, did not improve rectus femoris strength and knee range of motion immediately and 24 hours post-application in this sample. Okay. Now, I do believe that the vibration is actually supposed to inhibit muscle, right? So could that vibration be the reason that we don't have any effect? It should not be the reason 24 hours after application, but okay, there we go. Red dot. This is showing that, this is feeding into my bias that you cannot inhibit or facilitate by applying an origin to insertion. However, I did think that the amount of tension that we use will affect the application that we had. So this is showing that, no, I was wrong. It isn't about the tension that we're using either. That's not how we're facilitating or inhibiting muscles. Okay, next paper. So this is 2024, a nice recent one. The immediate effects of kinesiology tape on quadriceps muscle peak torque and knee joint repositioning error in healthy males, the effects of different tensions and directions. So I like that they've brought in knee joint repositioning, so like our joint control and potentially proprioception of that joint. But that is not our question here. Our question is, can we influence that peak torque? So let's have a look. The primary objectives of this study were to evaluate the effects of various tensions and directions in the application of kinesiotape on active and passive joint repositioning errors. So active joint repositioning errors, I have a tendency to forget this, and passive joint repositioning errors. Both of these abbreviations are talking about that joint control, as well as the maximum concentric peak torque, CPT, and the eccentric peak torque, EPT, of the quadriceps muscle in healthy males. Their methods, they had a repeated measures design with each participant acting as their own control. They had 4 measurements under different conditions, including origin to insertion kinesiotape with 0, 15, and 40% tensions, and insertion to origin kinesiotape with only 0% tension. If you want to go into like the detail of the application, this paper did a really good job of describing that, but I haven't included it here. These are their pictures. So this one, kinesiotape technique for vastus medialis and vastus lateralis from origin to insertion. And this one of vastus medialis and lateralis, kinesiotaping technique from insertion to origin. Their results, 21 healthy men, regardless of the tension type, the active joint control decreased after applying origin to insertion, and regardless of the tension type, passive joint control decreased following the application of origin to insertion kinesiotape. And there was no significant effect of time or tension type for concentric peak torque of the quadriceps. What does that mean? The results demonstrate that applying kinesiotape on the quadriceps from insertion to origin only affected active joint control, whereas origin to insertion led to decreases in both active and passive range of motion. I think that is positive. We have an improvement in the control of those joints, right? So this is a good thing. We have an effect. We have a positive effect on the control of our joints. However, neither the insertion to origin or origin to insertion caused changes in the concentric and eccentric contraction of the quadriceps muscle. Okay, so yes, we have positive effects on the joint control. No, we are not increasing our facilitation of muscle contraction. Our next paper is a 2016 paper, Facilitatory and Inhibitory Effects of Kinesiotape, Fact or Fad? Love this one. Okay, so they looked at origin to insertion, insertion to origin, and sham. They had their 3 groups. Participants were blindfolded, literally. They wore a blindfold so that they didn't know what was happening. And they actually made them all do like this little test so that they could see if they had any idea what kinesiotape is supposed to do. So that was actually quite interesting to read. And then they measured grip strength and they looked at EMG. So if you're wondering how this EMG application works, more than one study did it this way. Essentially, they take their tape, they cut a little hole in it where the electrode comes through the EMG pad, little hole there and a little hole there. And then, I think this one actually only has one pad. And then they apply that EMG pad, then they apply the kinesiotape over it, and then you can take the EMG reading through the kinesiotape. So pretty cool. Okay, so they looked at those wrist extensors and then did that impact grip strength. Results, we confirmed that 31 participants were successfully deceived and they were ignorant about kinesiotape. So that was quite cool. No significant difference was found in the maximum grip strength between the facilitatory and inhibitory kinesiotape or the control. There was no significant difference in the EMG between the 3 taping conditions. So this paper is in my corner. Kinesiotape does not facilitate or inhibit muscle activity. All right, our last one is a systematic review and meta-analysis. Does kinesiotape alter muscle strength in athletes? Okay, a systematic review and meta-analysis only of randomized controlled trials that evaluate the effect of kinesiotape on muscle strength and then compare it to a control group. 10 articles were included, and 5 in the systematic review, and then 5 were included in the meta-analysis. Their results: methodology quality, 3 were quite low, 7 were high. The risk of bias was very variable, bunch of other stuff. That's all fine. In conclusion, we conclude that kinesio tape, within the conditions discussed in this review, does not contribute to the gain of lower limb muscle strength in athletes with and without musculoskeletal injuries. The clinical relevance, RCTs that better clarify the criteria used in defining their population, right? Kinesio tape was not able to improve muscle strength in the lower limbs in athletes with or without musculoskeletal injuries. It is indicated that health professionals, that's us, such as physiotherapists and sports physicians, review their therapeutic approaches and seek other interventions most effective for improving muscle strength in this population. And this is my point, okay? I don't have a problem with kinesio tape. In fact, I love kinesio tape. It is absolutely one of my absolute favorite tools. But always question your goal. Always question what it is that you're trying to achieve. If we are aiming to facilitate a muscle to strengthen it because it's atrophied, why is it atrophied? And what are the best ways for us to facilitate that muscle's function? Because it's probably not kinesio tape, right? If that muscle atrophy is occurring because of pain, then we need to address that pain. Is it pain coming from a joint? Is it pain coming from the muscle itself? Are there trigger points in the muscle? We can treat trigger points with kinesio tape, and I love using them for that purpose. That's great. Okay, now we've taken away or potentially managed or improved the cause of that atrophy. Now, how do we strengthen it? How do we, return that function? What are our most effective tools for that goal? And it's not kinesio tape. All right, that's me. That's my high horse for today. I hope you guys have had a wonderful day and a wonderful month. Again, I love kinesio tape. This remains and will remain one of my favorite tools, just not for this particular goal. Have a great day, guys.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. A big thanks to our sponsor, Paul Prosper. Their sponsorship allows us to be able to give this podcast to you for free, so please go and check them out, paulprosper.com. Don't forget to bookmark the next Vet Rehab Summit. It's on Saturday, the 31st of October, 2026. Come and be a part of the world's largest online veterinary rehabilitation conference created specifically for you, the vet rehabber community. Onlinepethealth members get VIP complimentary access to the Vet Rehab Summit. For more information about continuing education for vet rehabbers, you can go to onlinepethealth.com. And if you want access to our free membership, we update the webinars in this area every 3 months. You can sign up at onlinepethealth.com/free.